So I think more interesting place to start is to look at the work of Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson. Acemoglu and Johnson are both MIT professors. This is a really interesting book, and what I'm going to try to what they claim in their book is that countries succeed or fail based on institutions as defined by property rights, a few things like this nature of property rights, the nature of the political system, etc. And what they have done, I think, very compellingly is provide some very interesting evidence along these lines. So I'm going to start by presenting the evidence, and then we'll think about given that evidence, how should we think about the world? Now, the first reason why this evidence is difficult is because institutions are endogenous. What do I mean when I say institutions are endogenous? You might say that, for example, to have effective property rights, we need effective courts. To have effective courts, we need effective judges. To have effective judges, we need an effective education system. To have an effective education system, we might need good property rights. So it might, all of these things are related, and we may, if the investment in the education system may not be effective without property rights, so all of these things are related. So basically, institutions are endogenous in the sense that lots of things that matter for other aspects of the economy also affect institutions. Institutions are a result of what else is happening in the economy. They're also a cause. So that's what makes it difficult. So how do you study the effects? Problem with things which are endogenous is that how do you study the effects of those? Because in some sense, the basic rule about studying the effect of something is what we want to do is we want to say, here's two countries. One country has better institutions than the other entirely by chance, not because this country has some other aspect that makes it better, right? The problem is we're worried that, if I say that Spain has better institutions than Portugal, then I would need to argue that this is not a result of the fact that Spain was to start with a stronger economy, and that's why the institutions came out. We want to say there are two countries which are essentially identical, and by an act of chance, Portugal got worse institutions than Spain. And those acts of chance are difficult to find. That's basically the challenge. So how does anybody solve this problem? Well, here's a very nice insight. The very nice insight is that in former colonies, so take the countries that were European colonies. There's a lot of countries, pretty much all of Africa and most of Asia and most of Latin America, all of Latin America, most of Asia and most of Africa were former colonies of either Britain, France, Holland, Portugal, Spain, or Belgium. I think essentially these 6 countries were, between them and Germany to a very small extent, had most of the world carved up. So most countries were colonies of these countries. And it turns out, not surprisingly, it's what was said a little while ago, institutions are persistent. So if good institutions were set up in this country a long time ago, they still remain relatively good. And if bad institutions were set up, so good and bad here are, I'm not telling you what good and bad are yet, I'll tell you what they mean in a minute, but the basic theory is that whatever institutions were set up a long time ago, that's how they stay. So institutions are persistent, that's step one. Step step 2 is to observe that when Europeans settled in a country, they were very clear about what kinds of institutions they want to set up. And that has a lot to do with whether they want to live in the country or not. If they didn't want to live in the country, so they just wanted to go there, control the country, and make some money from it, then these institutions they set up enabled making money quickly in the country. So they were not very protective of the local population. They were what are called extractive institutions, institutions which basically take the shape of, it's easy to kind of bully people, not a lot of legal protection, so that you could extract whatever you wanted. You want the mines to be very profitable. You don't really want legal rights for the workers, because if you had legal rights for the workers, then they would complain, and then you wouldn't get very profitable mines. So if you want mines to be profitable, the best way to do it is to not have many legal rights for workers. If you want labor to be cheap, you don't want to educate the labor force. If you want people to be docile, you don't want to have a lot of democracy. So basically, on the other hand, if you Europeans were going to stay there, then their vision for the country was very different. They wanted it to be livable and kind of like their lives in Europe, and then they set up institutions which were much less directly extractive. And that happens to be true, sadly enough. So what are countries where Europeans did settle, and what are countries where they didn't settle? Examples.
Well, the United States, Australia, Canada, Argentina, some New Zealand.
So those are good examples. What are countries where they didn't settle? And you can start to see what the pattern is going to be. What are countries where they didn't settle? Yeah. Sorry?
Oh, sorry. Well, even after Pioneers, they still didn't settle really in Africa.
Where in Africa did they settle? South Africa, to some extent Zimbabwe, to some extent Kenya. Those were 3 countries where they settled, and most other countries they didn't settle. So that's an example of and you can see that now one reason. So here's what's nice about their paper. They claim that one reason this happened was because of settler mortality. So if you look at these early colonies in the first years of settlement, there are massive mortality rates, really massive. Like 4 out of 5 people died within 5 years. I mean, that kind of mortality rates. Because Europeans were encountering new diseases, basically, new tropical diseases of all kinds. So the mortality rates were massive. And so therefore, the places where they agreed to settle were places where where the mortality rates were relatively low. And so one good predictor of what happens, whether you get one good predictor of whether you get European settlement or not is settler mortality in the early days. And so what they did, which is very creative, is to find a data set of settler mortality in these places. And so basically the idea is, let's look at what happens. Let's compare places where the settlers died in droves with places where they didn't.